Let's go with questions from the audience. We've got one sitting here for Daryl, and I think Dale, you could comment on this as well. It's been the topic of one of our previous webinars. So, Daryl, what's your sense of the beef on dairy presence in that mix as the cow herd in the U.S. is collapsing? So, Wade was asking, what is the prevalence of beef on dairy crosses in U.S. or Southern Plains feedlots making up that difference now?
Yeah, great question. I get this a lot. The numbers that I presented, I mean, the beef cow herd is specifically beef cow, so we've got dairy cow numbers too. However, our calf crop numbers, our feeder supply numbers, our feedlot numbers are all for all animals. So they already include those dairy animals. There's not an additional pool of beef on dairy animals. And one of the things to keep in mind is that we're crossbreeding these calves now, so they look different. We're utilizing them slightly different. We're learning how to feed them and so on, as you are in Canada. But the presence of these crossbred calves doesn't really change the number of animals in the industry. All those dairy cows were having calves before. They look different, but they all, the steers all ended up in feedlots before. The heifers that didn't get used for replacements ended up in the feedlots before, just as they are now. So the beef dairy cross thing, it has a number of implications in meat markets and in some other things, but it really doesn't change the overall numbers in the industry. So, USDA says our total feedlot inventory January 1 was about 14.2 million head, 14.4, excuse me, 14.4 million head. And that was just about 2% above a year ago, but that would include those beef and dairy calves. So there's not an additional pool of animals that's making up any difference for the reduced supplies that we have, or that reduced feeder supply that I showed you. That does include those animals because they're included in our inventory reports.
Okay, and there's another question here that's written for Daryl, but I actually think there's several of you who might want to take a jump at this. And how much is carcass weights offsetting this cow number issue as well? Dale, you've been around in the industry long enough to have seen carcass weights come up. Daryl, you can comment on it from the data, and Sylvain, you probably see data on what carcass size and meat cut sizes are doing. So comments from each of you, or Roger, if you wish to.
I'll start, I guess, and then you guys can jump in and clarify things. Carcass weights have been going up in general in the U.S. for 60 years, and they generally continue to. In the U.S. specifically, this last year, average steer carcass weights were actually down slightly from the year before, about 3 pounds. Heifers as well. I think heifers were down actually a little bit more. But that's an annual average number, so it persisted through the year. We do expect to see carcass weights come up this year. Probably there's certainly some incentives, and with cheaper corn prices, cheaper cost of gain in the feedlots, we do expect to see carcass weights come up in a shorter run sense. Now, in the long-term picture, I told you that actually our U.S. total cattle inventory, all cattle and calves, is in 2024 is at the same number of cattle that we had in 1951. And I looked the other day to speak to the long-term changes in this industry. We will produce in 2024 just about exactly 3 times as much beef with the same cattle inventory as we did in 1951. So, that long-term productivity story is pretty impressive in the industry. We've continued to see carcass weights go up, but it bounces around a little bit short term depending on feed cost, weather, and other things.
Dale, do you care to take a stab at that?
Yeah, I would agree with what Daryl has said. If you take and go back when we started 50 years ago, the genetic pool that we worked with is nothing like what we have now. I can remember bringing calves from the West, and we brought a pile of Hereford heifers that would weigh 350, 370 pounds, and lots of steers, 400, 420, and all Hereford genetics. There'd be a few blacks, but basically a Hereford genetic pool. Them calves would be all finished. There was lots of heifers that got shipped in Ontario, 800 to 900 pounds. And the Hereford steers, if they got to 11 and a half, there'd be the odd 12. Stuff that went to grass, excuse me, would be a bit bigger than that, but even when the Charolais breed coming with the cross, we took, and it wasn't very long till we had 12, 13, 1,400 pound cattle. And then now we've got 16, 1,700 pound cattle
Oh
that
my
we're
God.
with on steer wise. So we got a genetic pool that's completely different than what we had back in 50 years ago or 60 years ago. So there's as was mentioned, there's still a lot less cows, but there's quite a few more pounds, or as many pounds to deal with. So our herd expansion will not have to be as big to cover the loss that we've had because of the genetic pool that we're working with, in my opinion. But it has changed the genetic pool and our efficiencies, the way we feed them and everything else.
Thank goodness for animal science. I mean, I just those numbers are mind-boggling. I did my my doctoral thesis on mad cow. It was what, 2003, and visited 100 feedlots out west, and those numbers at the time were very different than today. So it's just been amazing. The entire industry is much more efficient producing proteins overall, and that's, I mean, it is a good news story overall, in my view.
Yeah, you know, fun fact in the US, you might find this interesting. For the last 5 years, on an annual average basis, the average steer carcass weight has exceeded the average cull bull carcass weight. Think about
Wow.
that for a little bit. And you could see them converging for a number of years prior to that. So what that says in my mind is, and I'm not a geneticist, but obviously we have more genetic potential, as Dale talked about. We've got very different cattle today, but it also speaks, I think, to the feeding technology that we're using. The ability to push the steers past the genetics of the parent animals tells me that, you know, we're utilizing implants and ionophores and beta agonists and those kind of things. And so, yeah, we've seen 5 consistent years now where steer carcass weights have exceeded bull carcass weights.
The last time you saw, or the markets, or does the current market situation mood remind you of a time previous? And if so, when? Daryl, for you on the cattle side and Sylvain on the retail side, if you care. Have you seen this structure before? This reminds you of the year such and such.
Yeah, you know, from my standpoint, looking at the cattle numbers and the cattle cycle situation, you know, I showed you that chart that showed you the price thing, and it looks a little bit now like it did in, you know, a decade ago.
2014.
Yeah, in 2014 and 15. But when you dig into it, it's actually a lot different. And so the short answer is no, I can't find an analog situation in the US industry, at least in the last several cattle cycles, where the female situation was what it is today. We essentially have no pipeline of heifers to begin any herd expansion. So, you know, if we decide to start retaining heifers in 2014, we're going to start with this year's heifer calves. We don't really have, in fact, I've already calculated, given the numbers we just got for January of 24, looking ahead for this year with the number of heifers that we have that USDA says are going to calve this year, beef cow slaughter in the US would have to drop 20% or more year over year just for us to hold the current herd inventory steady. And so growth is out of the question. Holding it steady is a long shot. We're likely to see some additional liquidation in 2024, and that's not assuming any drought situation. That's assuming just the numbers that we have to work with. And we're by no means out of the woods. In fact, the meteorologists are pretty scary about drought redeveloping in the U.S. in the second half of the year. So, you know,
Yeah.
I can't find an analog situation. On the face of it, it looks like 2014 and 15. I think beyond that, it's fundamentally quite a lot different. Specifically, it's going to take a lot longer to do any rebuild once we actually start trying to do it.
To juxtapose on Daryl's comments, retail wise, I mean, I'll be honest with you. I don't think beef can afford another 2014. If you remember 10 years ago, lots of butcher shops closed. I mean, we spooked the hell out of consumers in 2014, and it just can't happen again. And and grocers actually, retail wise, they make a lot of money selling meat, especially beef. So they'll be very careful this time around. And I know the dynamics are very different at Farmgate, but in retail, my sense is that that retailers, grocers are going to proceed with way more caution this time around. Like I said at the very beginning during my talk, price volatility is the enemy, not just high prices, and they know that, so they can't really just play around too much and spook the hell out of consumers again and face 2014. It was really devastating. We actually lost a lot of consumers, or a lot of consumers started to eat less beef in 2014. And so since 2014, we've seen this downward trend per capita, and things are leveling off a little bit, but I actually don't think that we're going to see prices really go up and down all that much over the next little while, despite what goes on up the food chain.
So let's shift gears here entirely for a little while, and then we might come back to some of those topics. What one of you mentioned trade, and certainly the beef industry here is an integrated global industry. So what geopolitical trade risks do you see? I'm not asking you to opine about the things we can't foresee, but things that are unresolved we haven't talked about yet tonight that people should think about as potential risks. Roger, you illuminated that list of risks. Where does that sit for each of you?
Specifically from a U.S. perspective, our trade response thus far has been exactly what you would predict in this situation. So 2023, beef exports decreased, imports increased. Both of those are market responses to less beef supply in the U.S., higher prices in the U.S., and we have had a strong dollar, which is a headwind for exports from a U.S. perspective, and favors more imports. So the response has been, pretty much as expected in that respect. But I think globally, we have a number of things to be concerned about. I mean, in the last few years, China has risen so quickly to be the biggest beef importing country in the world. The U.S. was for many years, and now China, if you add China and Hong Kong together, which I do because they're really one market, they're 2.5 times the level of beef importer that the U.S. is now. So with the economic concerns in China, I think that has to be, a source of concern. Obviously just the broad level geopolitical stuff. I mean, wars here, wars there, whatever, creates an environment of uncertainty. And to Sylvan's, point, markets don't like uncertainty and consumers don't like uncertainty. And so I think all of those are going to be, among the bigger potential threats to the cattle industry will be those outside shocks and sources of uncertainty that could potentially, I don't think they change what's going to happen, at least in the U.S. market, but they could certainly derail it for a few months or a few weeks and cause some, a lot of anguish and heartache as we try to wrestle through those things, even if ultimately we kind of get back on the supply-driven track that seems to be in place.
Chris, can I answer your question after November of this year?
Sure.
Seriously, every time former President Trump talks about trade or anything, the needle moves and he's not even reelected. It's just really, this year is going to be an emotionally draining year until we get to November. But as Daryl said, it's all about U.S. and China. That's where it's going to play out, and Canada is going to be stuck in between again, just watching the parade go by and see what's going to happen with China's demand and what goes on with the drought in the U.S. and headwinds affecting supply in the U.S. So that's really, in my view, that's really what should be on everyone's radar.
So one of the questions in the chat alluded to this idea, could Canada be insulated from some of those global forces? And Dale, you've been involved with enough of the leadership stuff in the industry to probably give your comment on this too. But I think we're hearing Sylvain say not very likely.
No, I'd agree. We're not insulated from it in Canada at all, because if you take a look at our Canada market, we're dependent on exports to the south. 40% of our product produced in Canada gets exported. So what happens in the States is going to happen to us. Whatever, whether it's their election or whatever worldwide politics, whatever affects the United States will have a downturn on what's going to happen here. I think another thing that maybe I've been in it too long, but there's nothing will cure high prices like high prices. If the price stays too high too long, consumers will resist it. And I wouldn't feel any different if I was a consumer. There's nothing better than beef to eat. But if you go to the consumer meat case and you've got X other products to choose from, and you got so many dollars of disposable income to take and feed your family with, and you're paying higher interest on your house and your mortgages and your kids' university, we will lose some per capita consumption. We always have in the past. And I know that's a doom and gloom thing to say, but high prices will cure high prices. And that's the last thing beef farmers want to hear. But this is a cyclical, I'm going to make it sound like it's a sick business. It's a cyclical business. And I think we have to always be cognizant of this fact that this will change when we least expect it's going to change. And there'll be some triggers, whether it's worldwide or politically, it'll be something that changes it, that all of a sudden, yes, there's reduced cow numbers, there's reduced this or that, but it could be energy things, it could be carbon things. It will be something that changes it that won't be positive is what will happen. And that's maybe just being in this industry too long, but when you take
I don't think you're wrong, Dale. You're absolutely right. What has changed, I think, over the last, I'd say, decade is that, high pork prices will be beef's problem. High chicken prices will be beef's problem as well. That's the thing. That's what we're noticing right now, is that beef is meat, chicken is meat, pork is meat. And if there's something that actually spoofs consumers at the meat counter, they move away from the category altogether. That impacts beef as well. I'd say probably 10 years ago, 15 years ago, if beef prices did go at, like in 2014, for example, when beef prices went up, they went for chicken or pork. It's not that simple anymore.
So then on this, go ahead, Dale. No, you go ahead.
Another thing that's happening in the States, you've got expanded meat packers capacity, which is going to take and coming on board soon, which is great. But you've also got reduced numbers for them to work with. So there's going to be an abundance of hook space, and there isn't going to be the cattle to take and deal with that. And there's going to be some people that won't make it in the packing business in the United States, which is bad, because that affects us here in Canada too. It'll be great for a short period of time till everybody realizes, holy smokes, there's no margin in this stuff. And all of a sudden, the hook space gets shut down and it's not there. And that'll take and have a bearing on it too. We've been through this in Canada, where we lost lots of hook space, and we still could use more hook space, but have an abundance of it and more supposedly coming online, but we don't have anything coming in North America to fill that pipeline up. So that means down the road here in a couple of years or so, then them plants can't create margin and dollars to survive. Them hook spaces will disappear. All of a sudden that creates less competition for it and puts it back into the packers' hands to work on.
So let's shift gears here then towards, I guess a little more the outcome of the discussion, why we're here. So, we've laid out some of these scenarios and some of the challenges. You've all spoken to them. So is the beef industry as an industry ready for some kind of unforeseen event? Do people not, Roger, I'm going to come to you first. And you can think, to your book of business if you wish, or however you want to look at this. Is the beef industry, are the people on this webinar tonight ready to go should these things happen?
Well, I can't in general. I mean, I could make a generalization, but that would be doing discredit to, the individual producer that is on this, because it's. If I look at my book of business and my sense of the industry, it's all over the spectrum. Long term, those producers need to have been doing the right things more often than not. You've just spent a few minutes talking about a lot of geopolitical risks, that a lot of things that we just can't control. That's just the nature of the beast in the beef industry, and we've, one mean or another, that each producer has had to deal with that over the decades, to be into this business long term. A point that I should make when we talk about working capital is, in talking to your banker, like, make sure you've got the right structure. If your operating limit is too low here today and you're operating at the upper limit, you are not prepared for anything to go sideways. And for a number of reasons, both within your control and out of your control, there's a lot of risks in this industry, and that can take you sideways in a hurry. And so make sure you're properly structured. Talk to your banker. Can we look at increasing this operating limit? Because who knows what's going to happen, but if the cycle turns, we're going to need some cushion until it rectifies itself. If there's one point that I can make tonight, that's planning early, thinking ahead, thinking about things that aren't happening today but that could happen. And I know Daryl said the markets don't like animosity, and I've seen over the last 5-6 years, I've seen inverted markets here. Typically, there's been your short-term rates are lower than your longer-term rates, but there's been so much animosity in the world and turmoil. The world doesn't know what's really going to go on short-term, and there's a premium that the market's attached to that when there is animosity. So I can see coming out into this year that there's maybe the markets are trying to get to a much more normal situation, but those are the kind of things that aren't out of your control, but that you have to deal with, and they deal with your bottom line and how to best structure yourself to absorb those kind of things. So not just looking at your working capital, but adjusting your working capital and to see exactly what limit that you've got to work with, and forecasting what's coming down the pipeline that for sure, and providing a buffer space for those things that could impact you.
Dale, did you care to comment on that?
No, I think Rod pretty well summed that one up.
Yeah, I thought so too. That was a bit of a.
There's nothing could be said any more plainer than that. Like, this business does have high risk associated with it, and you have to have a plan, and as was said before, you have to work with your banker to have a plan for what you're going to do in them situations, because that's the first person you're going to need when you do have some tough times. And trust me, this business has seen a lot of them in the late 70s, early 80s. The interest rates, I lived through that, which was a nightmare of its own. And then we went through recession after that, which was recession. There was farms that were bought in 1980 that wouldn't bring their value if they had to be sold till 1995. And we were running then on 12-14% interest money. If they'd had to been sold, they wouldn't have brought what their purchase price was in 1980. If it was a place where time that they had to be sold, whether it was financial, divorce or something, or death in the family, and a forced sale, they wouldn't bring their money. And then we went through BSE.
I'm mostly concerned, of course, I've done a lot of work with the beef industry and out west, and scalability is certainly not an issue. And so I know that Ontario has smaller farms in general, but I do think that there are opportunities out there for different niche markets, for example, different ways of doing things. When we look at our data, consumers are looking for different things. They're looking for local, they're looking for fresh, they're looking for, free of hormones and things like that. So there's lots of possibilities out there. You just need to think about your possibilities. Of course, connecting with the market. I know of farms now that are, running ghost kitchens in different parts of the country where they actually connect with consumers in food service. So I'm not suggesting that this is your thing in Ontario, but there are different possibilities for sure for farmers, for ranchers out there.
What are the top two things each of you would give as advice to those on tonight in terms of preparing themselves to reduce their financial risk going forward for whatever comes? We've done enough doom and gloom. We've talked enough about, analogies to tough times and challenges in the cow herd and so forth. What are the two things people can go away tonight, do for themselves to improve their risk profile? And I won't make you go first, Dale. I'll maybe come to Roger. Roger, you've pretty much started down this road with us tonight, so go ahead.
Sure. Yeah, no problem. Two things. We've talked about knowing your business, but more specifically, when you say knowing your business, know your costs, own your financials, know your financials. You're going to throw a tax return at your banker. That is not a financial statement. That is built for, avoiding, eliminating tax. It's built for a different purpose. And, our tax system in this country allows us to do that, but it is not a very fantastic tool to lend against. So consequently, there's an awful lot of questions that are, that have to be asked to kind of get behind those numbers, get around those numbers. So if you're not prepared to own your business on paper and what you're presenting and just lay it and ask your banker to figure it out himself, A, that's not fair. And B, I don't think that you think very much of your business if that's all that the effort that you're prepared to do to put into your capital source for your business. Second thing, talk to your banker early, have a plan. The bank is very, very aware of this industry, that it's a cyclical industry. There's going to be profits, but there's going to be losses. And there's going to be times where you're going to be looking at, your working capital. We're going to be looking at your working capital. And if there is a plan put together, we're going to say, oh, it's a little shy. It's quite a bit shy. We're not going to have enough. You're going to have to pull out some tools out of the toolbox. There might be some refinancing that goes on. And if we're refinancing, essentially you're utilizing up equity. And on a long-term basis, the taste of equity gets, a little sour. You're eroding your base for your operation. So if we're going to go down that road, then let's have a plan. Let's try and make sense of what we know. You've been in this business for decades. Somehow you have got from point A to point B. Somehow you've gone through several cycles. How did you get through that? And how are we going to get through what we see is coming down the pipe at us?
Dale, if you wanted to if you were giving advice to your peers, which I guess is why we have you on tonight, what would you say?
Well, I think just as Roger has previously mentioned here, I think you have to know your costs. And by costs, break down your costs, break down your cropping costs. If you're putting it through your cattle, know what them costs are, what your opportunity costs are if you're going to take and sell that crop, or are you going to feed it to the cattle? And if that crop always has the value of what it's worth to sell as a cash crop, use that value to put in when you're feeding it to cattle, because if you're not, you're only fooling yourself. because that crop did have another value. It had a cash crop value. Right now, it'll pay you to feed it through the cattle, but there was years where you had to put that cost in, because if you didn't, you were missing out on maybe that it wouldn't have paid to feed the cow. Relationship banker, very critical, at least in our circumstances and operation. We've had to work with the bankers for 50 years. There was lots of times I had goals I didn't want to have to deal with them, but we never reached them and still haven't. We have to have that relationship that is, and it gets, I can remember 30 years, 40 years ago, having to do cash flows and wondering, what kind of junk is this we prepared? Why don't we just hand them a coloring book and fill out a bunch of colors? I actually look forward to doing cash flow projections now and doing, inventory monthly and all them things, because when you have your hand on top of that stuff, you present it to your banker. They know that you know your operation. When you're doing inventory for the bank every month, you can watch that margin money, what's happening, and doing that. And them's all tools that you get to watch for in your own operation. And it isn't that you hand it all the banker and he phones and tell you, well, I think you got a problem. That's not the way to be able to build a business and be able to have a relationship with your banker. That it's got to be a lot of onus put on us, the producer, to work with a bank, because they've got to look after the money that they're letting out too. So know your costs and know your financials and do your homework. I think it's very critical.
Doctors Peel or Charlebois, any comments?
Yeah, I can go first. I guess I'm a supply chains guy, so I'll perhaps provide some advice about the supply chain. I mean, I think you would do yourself a service if you take a few minutes or some time to understand the supply chain, connecting you with the consumer. So understand the consumer, where consumers are at today. Veganism is not up in Canada. It's at about 2.1%. It has gone up in years. Vegetarianism is not up, but there's something going on. Consumers are looking for different things. So do your homework and try to understand what is happening with consumers. What are they thinking about, environmental stewardship, about animal welfare, about as I mentioned earlier. I mean, we did do a survey. The younger generations are really thinking about agriculture very differently, and that's really driving decisions at the grocery store, at the restaurant. And also understand your customer. There's lots going on right now, and I did talk about the code of conduct very briefly, but the code of conduct, in my view, if it is implemented, and my belief is that it will be implemented, it will be a mandatory code of conduct, your customer will likely be impacted by that. And that could address a bunch of issues. And I know that packers aren't popular with farmers typically, but packers are going to be impacted by what's happening right now in Ottawa, where I am. Actually, I have some meetings tomorrow with some folks here about this. And if this thing happen, it will impact how supply chains actually work, not necessarily prices, but we're talking about contractual terms, how things are negotiated. The supply chain bullying that we've seen over the years has to stop. I think everyone agrees. A lot of MPs here agree, so they're thinking of doing something about it. And that's going to change supply chain dynamics. And I think you need to take some time to pay attention to that.
Daryl.
Yeah, Sylvan mentioned the supply chain. So think about the beef industry with cow-calf, feedlot. We've got stockers sometimes too, so you can put them in there. Feedlot, packers, retailers, all the way to the consumer. They're all connected, although I remind producers a lot of times that they're connected by bungee cords. They're not connected by sticks. So they don't all move at the same pace. They do, however, impact each other, and they will adjust over time. The key factor in my view, in the market we're in today, again, we've got this lack of cattle inventory. It's a primary supply problem. The market and the prices we're seeing are really focused at the cow-calf level. And so what you've got is that everybody above the cow-calf level in this industry is a margin operator. First and foremost, it's all about buy-sell margins. And so when you're in a situation like this, the price support pressure is coming from the bottom up. And typically what that means is that every margin sector is going to feel a squeeze in this environment because their input side from the bottom up is going up faster and more than their output side is. Now they will adjust some over time all the way to the consumer, but in the meantime, everybody's going to get squeezed. So at least in the US, as we go forward here, 2023 was a pretty good year for cattle feeders in the US because they were selling record fed cattle prices at 2022 feeder cattle prices. But now the feeder cattle prices are moving faster. And that going forward, every turn of cattle is going to have more potential for a margin squeeze. And even with cheaper cost of gain, that's going to help a little bit. It's going to make them feel like they got to be more competitive for a limited supply of cattle. But the bottom line is they're going to be chasing smaller numbers of cattle and paying more for them. And so their margins are going to get squeezed. Packers are feeling it already, and they're going to feel it a lot more. Retailers haven't felt it too much yet in the US, I don't think, but they will. And consumers will see some of that too. And so everybody will share a part of this margin squeeze as we go forward. And so then to the comments that have been made, I'm not a finance expert by any means, but it means that we are going to go through some lean times. We're going to challenge your financial capacity. And so you need to be very proactive, working with your banker and so on to make sure that you have the capacity and a plan in place to sort of weather this storm. It is a part of a cyclical industry. So eventually we will adjust. And I think Dale made the point earlier that high prices will cure high prices, and they will again. At some point in time, the market, the cattle industry will respond to high prices that are targeted towards short supplies, and will increase supplies, and we'll produce our way back into lower prices. I think that's going to take several years in the U.S., but in the meantime, I think a lot of pieces of the supply chain are going to have to really do their homework. Obviously, managing costs on that side is critical. Some overt risk management marketing tools may play an important role tactically, and a lot of it is just being prepared to and recognizing that it's gonna take some time to work through all of this.
Awesome. So I'll just give a few seconds if anyone else wants to throw a final comment. We're going to wrap it up here now. So Roger, Sylvain, if you guys had some final comments as well to the group assembled before we pass it back over to Brent here in a moment.
Just leading off of what Daryl said there, that's why I've lost a lot of hair and I'm going gray, managing risk for all of the book of business that I have. Your banker may not think that they're their partner sometimes, but sometimes saying no is the best, is a good decision. And it's hard to hear, but it's difficult to protect people from themselves. It really is. It's a lot of energy. It's a lot of energy output to do that. But and following off of what Dale said there on the contracting, there's a lot of tools that are in the toolbox that you can use for your business. So be aware of those things that you know and that can manage well yourself. And maybe contracting isn't the first tool that you would pull out of the toolbox. If you're not weighing cattle or not buying them properly, if your feed or bunk management isn't up to spec, those are some things that you can probably better your business first before dabbling into contracting or hedging. And I'm not saying that you're going to get the same win off of it, but work on the things that you can control first and primarily first.
And last comment to our food professor.
Well, again, thank you, Chris, for inviting me. I'm an academic. I have an easy job. I just look at things, I study things, but I have a lot of respect and towards people who feed us. If you're listening in and if that's your job to produce food, well, thank you. Thank you very much for what you're doing. And I know it's tough out there, but anyways, I do want to thank you very much for everything you're doing. It's great. Don't forget about the role you play within the supply chain.
Awesome. Thank you very much. And just before I let the four of you go, the comments in the chat, if you've not been following, everyone's very impressed with your contributions tonight. So thank you very much, Dr. Peel. Thank you, Dale. Thank you, Roger. And thank you, Sylvain. Good to see you again. And turning it back over to Brent to take us home for the rest of the night.